In this lesson, we'll speed model the central tree element holding up the building. So essentially, we're talking about this element here, and it's the second most important part or object of this building, and hence why we're doing it first instead of focusing on something like the structure or these smaller pods that are scattered underneath. So what we're going to be doing is essentially modeling a central core and then creating a very abstracted version of a tree. Remember, we don't want to go too realistic because it is going to be too kitsch if we do that. And then we want to give it an appearance that the tree is within a sphere of some kind, that the branches basically finish and create an impression of a sphere, and that sphere is sitting, or that dome of that sphere is just above the building, and that sphere is visible from below as well. Then we're later going to cut the building out, and we're going to start looking at how we can access onto that platform, create the reception area that feeds us up into the lift tower, and basically we'll continue with the building. So again, I'm going to pull this just to the side so that I can see it, and you can print a version of yourself if you want to follow along by looking at the sketch which is provided in the referenced files folder. So one thing you can do at this point is you can remove or at least hide all the elements that you've created for yourself which relate to the areas. So I can at this point create another layer, and I can basically move all of the area geometry onto the area layer. So I'm going to do that with all of them, and I'm only going to leave this construction line underneath the building itself. So all of these objects I'm going to now be creating on my building layer, and I'm not going to exactly say what that is. It's not going to be called steel or glass or anything yet. It's just going to be called building because we're still working with the massing of all of this. So now in top view, I'm going to decide where I want this central tree element to be. So I'm going to start by drawing a simple circle. You can even snap it onto that point, and it doesn't really matter what size. We're going to be adjusting that later. So the radius, now that we can input the figure here on the right, let's go and put a radius of 5 meters and see how that looks. Again, we have to think about the practicality of there being a lift tower and services inside. And we also have to think about the aesthetic proportions of this lift tower as it goes up through the entire building. So I'm going to extrude this now, and we're going to extrude it right up through the building. And I think that more or less that is looking quite good because the thickness is almost as wide as the building is here, and now we can start thinking about the canopy. So next, let's go and do the same thing with the sphere that's going to be surrounding and making the canopy. So let's go and create that using the same central point, and we can also decide where the sphere should be. Remember that you can also turn off your context if it is confusing you, the context model that is, and you can now go and adjust the radius, and you can decide for yourself where you would like that to be. So for example, this looks quite good to me. I want to have a central spine, I want to have the canopy reaching out to this extremity, and I want that dome just above the building. Then what I'd like to do is make sure that just a part of it is showing from underneath, and I want more or less there to be the penetration to basically allow me to cut out the sphere so that I have a large void in my main square object. Now what I'm going to do is Boolean the two. So I'm going to make a copy of this object. So I'm going to type Ctrl-V on my keyboard, make a copy, and select the copied version and the main square. And what I can also do is make a copy of that main square, and generally what I do is either hide it, rename it, save it as an object, in other words save selected, or what I also like to do is just move it down in my scene and have it as a backup, which has now been moved down by 50 meters. So this object here we're going to Boolean, and we can do that by going to compound objects, Boolean, and we can now go and choose subtraction. Option, or at least operand B, will be the sphere, and now we've just cut out our sphere object. Once we go back into the scene, we can look at what the result is. Basically, there's our sphere and there's our object pushing through it. So what you can see is that really we're working on very, very simple objects, and we're making the main decisions as to where things are going to be placed and how they're going to be proportioned. And this is the most important thing when you don't have accurate plans to work from, is basically you want to keep things simple in the beginning and then go and add a detail afterwards. So the next thing we can do is start to look at how we may want to add some form to this tree. So one of the things we can do is add a taper. This is quite a quick modifier to really make quite rapid changes to your model. So without much hassle, you can go and taper that cone down so that it goes towards a smaller circle on top. And then in my front view, let's go and add a few very conceptual branches. And those I'm going to do by just drawing a normal spline with corner and corner, initial and drag. So let's go and do that in a way that doesn't look too kitsch. So I'm going to just do a very simple branch. And we're going to make it look like so. And then afterwards, once I'm done, I'm going to make some more adjustments to it. So here I'm going to grab the vertices and I'm just going to adjust those manually. So essentially I want to make something look almost like it's just indicative of what it's meant to be looking like. Once you're happy with the form, you can go and move it into place. So let's go and move it in plan view so that it is exactly in the middle. And I can also go and just isolate these two objects. Now this is going to be my tree element. I would like to now rotate it around the central cone. So I'm going to add a bevel to this. And you can see that everything I do, I'm going to try keep the original line or an original flat poly in the bottom of my stack so that I can keep things quite simple at their base level. And that's a quite important tip, because when you do your editing, it's much easier to edit a simple line than editing a fully three-dimensional object. I'm going to now give a couple of figures to the bevel, so that basically we have a tree object which is quite large, and we're going to give it a outline and 0.1 here. And you can now see we just have this very simple beveled abstracted object. So now to rotate it around, we basically are going to be creating an array. So what we need to do is move the pivot point into the center of this central object. So we need to have a look at this X value. So let's go and copy that X value from there, and let's paste it into the pivot point X value over there. Next, we want to also move the pivot point in the center in the Y direction. So we're going to do exactly the same thing, this time copying the Y value. Now we are ready to either manually hold it down Shift and just rotate it, but obviously you would then have to calculate how many degrees and how many rotations you need. So instead we're going to be using the array tool, and here we can much quicker have a look at a preview. If I just move it slightly out the way, and we're going to be creating a rotation, and we want 360 degrees. And now you can start to adjust how you would like this to be done. So let's say we would like to have 7 of those. If I now look in my top view, I start to get something that looks a little bit like a baobab tree, which is more or less what my concept was indicating. So as you can see, by using things like a taper modifier, by using the array tool, you can start getting much quicker results than modeling everything manually one by one. And remember that if things are properly instanced, which they should be, if I just go back a level, then once you do your array, you definitely need to remember to choose instance, because you want to make sure that when you change one thing, or at least one element, you will have a change globally. And that is quite an important aspect to remember when you want your modeling to speed up, because the last thing you want to do is make many changes to many objects around your entire scene. If you were just able to adjust all of your window frames with one single value in your modifier stack instead of changing them in your model, it's going to speed up your workflow 100 times. So that is definitely an important tip to remember, is keep instancing. And if you have a modifier for similar objects like window frames, then instance it throughout your entire building so that you can control it through one object. So that brings us to the end of this lesson. We've modeled up the crude form for the central element, which is enough for now. We also have this, which we can later turn into a mesh or another type of LED element if we wanted to create something creative there. But next, in the next lesson, we're going to look at the internal structure to this main form, and we're going to start dividing it up further and creating the skeleton that holds all of that in place. So hang on for that as we do some geometric structural work on this object.